Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature.
My mother went bankrupt during the financial crisis. We were served an eviction notice from our apartment. All of these things came crashing down, and I never was comfortable about saying it. What shifted for me was that General Assembly that first night and people getting up and telling their stories.
That was activist Nalini Stamp, sharing her experience from the early days of the 2011 Occupy Wall Street protests. When public movements erupt, public attention almost immediately shifts to the immediate spectacle, the headlines, the street confrontations, and the rapid-fire political commentary. Once the news cycle moves on, we rarely stop to analyze how the media ecosystem shaped what we saw or what actually happens to that momentum after the cameras leave. Looking back at a landmark event like Occupy gives us a baseline to measure how much our media landscape has shifted since 2011, operating right on the precipice of algorithm-driven social media. Understanding how coverage, police response, and decentralized leadership functioned then helps make sense of how public attention is captured and manipulated today. A couple of weeks ago, we shared a special feed drop on our show, Episode 1 of Occupy and Unfinished Uprising, a multi-part series examining the legacy of Occupy from our friends at Future Hindsight, a sister show in the Democracy Group podcast network. This is the Outrage Overload podcast. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and today I'm joined by the host of that Occupy series.
My name is Mila Atmos. I am the host of Future Hindsight, which is a civic engagement show. Our tagline is that we take the big ideas in civic life and democracy and turn them into action items for you and me. And I was inspired to do the show in the wake of the 2016 election when everybody across the board, I think across the spectrum of political opinion and political beliefs, felt that they did not get the election that they wanted. Right? It didn't really matter what side of the aisle you were on. People wanted something different. And I thought that the cure to this would be more civic engagement, more civic action. And so Future Hindsight is a mission-driven show. And what we want to do is inspire people to take civic action and get involved.
Mila approaches these topics with a perspective that balances big-picture systemic analysis with actionable takeaways. Her team spent months digging into the primary accounts, media reports, and long-term offshoots of Occupy for their series, which runs through August 13th. We talked about how organic movement building in 2011 differs from today's hyper-incentivized algorithmic ecosystem, how the media's reaction to leaderless movements feeds into polarization, and whether moments like Occupy truly fizzle out or just evolve into new forms of civic engagement. Quick note before we jump in. Making this show takes time and resources, and we couldn't do it without you. If you're enjoying what you hear and want to help us keep the mic on, consider supporting us. Head over to outrageoverload.net/give or click the link in our show notes right now to chip in. Every little bit makes a huge difference. Thank you. Now, enjoy my conversation with Mila Atmos. Mila Atmos, thank you so much for making time for our program.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I mean, your show is quite impressive. I aspire to have the kind of quality in editing and writing that you guys are doing over there. So congratulations on the show and congratulations on this Occupy Wall Street series.
Thank you so much for your kind words. That means so much to us, truly. We are a very tiny team. Future Hindsight is a two-people show, just the producer, Zach, Travis, and myself. But for Occupy, we had another producer join us, and so we were a three-person team for the Occupy series. We really pour our hearts and souls into this show.
Oh, that's amazing. That's awesome. So you're doing the series on Occupy, which is actually really cool because it is one of those things that, oh yeah, that happened. I kind of forgot about that. And so this happened in 2011, and it was kind of on the beginning. It was kind of before the algorithms really took over sort of social media and the public attention to some degree. You know, how did the mechanics of spreading a message organically back then differ from how a movement has to navigate this kind of hyper incentivized algorithm in the ecosystem we're in now?
Well, 2011 was just the beginning of social media. And so I think people were paying attention to social media in this a very different kind of way, in the sense that people were just so curious and wanted to be a part of it. I mean, I think now a lot of people are trying to make sure that they're not constantly on their devices. But at the time, it was a novelty, you know. They had a live stream going, and the live stream person literally ran around with a laptop and a camera and a bunch of cables. So it was the kind of thing that's so different than today. Today, you can just walk around with your cell phone and just make sure it's charged. And so I think because of the novelty at the time, people were really into it. Twitter was new. They had, I want to say, at least 2, maybe 3 Twitter accounts. And so Facebook also was really, really big at the time still. And people followed Facebook and Twitter to find out what was happening on the ground directly with Occupy. And that was new. And not only was social media exciting because it was new, but also Occupy was exciting, right? To follow this anti-capitalist village in real time seemed like an opportunity that was totally unique, and it was.
Yeah, for sure. So, you know, a big piece of Occupy was that they rejected this idea of centralized leadership. And that got mocked. That idea got mocked sometimes. But do you think that a lack of like a clear spokesperson made it harder for mainstream to sort of box it in to a neat narrative, or do you think it made it more vulnerable to media spin?
I think it cut both ways. I would say that the media spin, especially comedy hours, you know, if you recall, we actually had a little section on this where we include a snippet of Samantha Bee making fun of the leaderlessness. But I think the whole idea, though, was that it was so inclusive and that it wanted to make sure that all the voices were heard. And while that was difficult, I think it showed everyday people that there is a way to include all the voices. And I don't know whether this specific movement would have been better with one charismatic leader. I'm not convinced that would be the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely showed a different way of doing things. Another thing that came out of it was this language around the 99% and the 99% versus the 1%. And, you know, it was really a unifying idea that people could kind of latch on to. But subsequently, do you think that meme has held up? Like, has it been sort of co-opted? Has there been a pivot on it that has kind of made it have a different message now, and it doesn't really speak with that unity, and it's more of a culture war, speaks into the culture war polarization more? How do you think that meme has held up?
Well, I think the meme has held up really well in a sense that, you know, I had a conversation about this recently about normalizing taxing the rich. And that, of course, has been around for a long time. You know, that is how we got the constitutional amendment to have income tax. So that was, I want to say, in the 1920s. It's the kind of thing where taxing the rich is super old, but the 99%, that is not super old. I think in a sense that this was something that just captured the sentiment of the unfairness of the system, and also to normalize these talking points, you know, to mainstream the idea that the 99% are different, they're everyday people, from the 1%. And I think even today, what we see is the idea that left versus right is not as compelling as 99 versus 1%. And I think, you know, in various forms, this has continued to have legs.
And do you speaking with the activists that were there then and were promoting these ideas then, do they feel like the idea has been co-opted? Do they feel it still has kind of its original intent and serves a good purpose? Or, you know, what's the sort of sentiment around that from the advocates?
Well, I can't speak for them myself, but I would venture to guess that some people feel that it has, you know, stood the test of time, and some people feel that it has been co-opted. There are some people who are really hardcore and wanted to make sure that politicians didn't co-opt the movement and didn't, you know, use Occupy to win elections. You know, some of the organizers were anarchists, and they were anti working together with politicians and co-opting this idea that this is an anti-capitalist village that is trying to show the rest of the world that there is an alternative way to have a life and to have a society. And so, having said that, there are some people who work, for example, for city council. Sandy Nurse, for example, is now a city council member, and Nalini Stamp, who was working at the Working Families Party at the time when she was involved in Occupy and still works there today, and she's now the national strategy director. And it's the kind of thing where everybody has a slightly different take, but I think the idea that the 99% is being taken advantage of, that continues to resonate, even in different, I don't want to say in different forms, but to different degrees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point there. It reminded me that it's easy for any of us to sort of generalize this group and sort of, just oversimplify what the makeup of it was and what kind of a coalition it was. And so it's anytime we're talking about it, it's very hard because it was sort of a lot of different players with different agendas that were involved in this.
Yes. There were a lot of different players with different agendas. And I think that's one of the strengths, but also one of the weaknesses, right? But having said that, I think it gave us an example of how a big tent movement can look like, that it needs to have different people and different variations across the spectrum in order to really have impact. Because I think if you have, a very, very small, idealistically homogeneous group, I think it doesn't sell.
Mm-hmm. Well, like you say, it kind of cuts both ways a little bit because, if you can't find some sort of common goals or common objectives, I guess I should say, to kind of wrap around, they can be a little hard because now no one knows how to report it or what exactly they're trying to achieve. But on the other hand, I think it is a great example of building coalitions that they're not going to be ideologically pure.
Yes. No, they're not going to be ideologically pure. I think that's just a fantasy, that's not how real life is anyway. I mean, nobody that I know experiences life in a way that is ideologically pure. I mean, you can go to the grocery store and it feels like, you have so much friction.
Well, yeah. 100%. But I mean, that's something I think our current political environment could really take a lesson from is, that you have to build coalitions and to get anything done. And, this idea that you'll go put together an ideologically pure group and that's how you'll achieve something. It's just, as you say, it's just not realistic.
Right. It doesn't even happen on the right. It's also not ideologically pure.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to talk a little bit about, in the series, I think you use the term violently flamed out. And I want to talk about that sort of flame out side of it a little bit too. When institutions respond to a movement like this with this overwhelming force, what does that do to the institution's legitimacy of law enforcement, legitimacy of the state? How did that sort of framing that as a flame out contribute to the cynicism we see today, do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, there's so many ways to answer this question, but when you mentioned law enforcement, right? So, for example, law enforcement was, pretty violent when they arrested some of these protesters who were literally peacefully protesting or just walking across the bridge. And it was very confusing, of course, when they walked across the Brooklyn Bridge. And when they were arresting these people, they were kettling them and they were tear gassing them in their faces, So it was the kind of thing where I think everyday Americans haven't seen violence against peaceful protesters in a long time. Of course, that also existed in the 60s. But for a lot of young people, this was totally new. And it looked like, there's a clip that went viral of two young white women who were being pepper sprayed in their faces and then kettled and arrested. And it was the kind of thing where people thought, wait, what? This kind of thing happens? I think that eroded a lot of the legitimacy of law enforcement. And it also, ironically, made the Occupy movement stronger because then people wanted to know what's happening down there and how can I get involved, because it sounds like people are really putting their money where their mouths are, meaning that they're putting their skin in the game. They're protesting and they were arrested.
Yeah. Yeah, it's high stakes.
It's high stakes, exactly. So I think when people see high stakes activity, they're curious.
Mm-hmm. And for the audience that may not know this idea of kettling, this is kind of this approach where the police kind of form this way where you can't actually get away even if you're not really involved, and suddenly everyone's kind of trapped, and then they just sort of arrest everyone.
Yes. Well, they use a net. So that's important to include, that they use a net and then really you cannot escape.
Yeah, even if you kind of weren't even involved, you're just kind of caught up in it.
You're right. You're just caught up in it. You could just be, in a regular protest walking. And if you're kettled, then it doesn't matter that you were kind of, an innocent bystander or participant of the protest.
Yeah. So for sort of the exhausted majority out there that kind of want better understanding, does the fact that Occupy sort of fizzled out feed this narrative that nothing ever changes and there's nothing much we can do? Does it kind of feed that, or do you think it inspired, or maybe a little bit of both?
Well, yes, a little bit of both, but I think there are a lot of descendants, let's call it, from Occupy in the fight for social and the fight for economic justice today. I would argue that the surge in popularity for union membership comes directly out of Occupy, because they worked together with labor unions at the time in 2011 to demonstrate. The Fight for 15 also comes out of Occupy. There's an organization called Strike Debt, which is working to eliminate student debt, but they started with medical debt. They actually bought up medical debt for pennies on the dollar and then just forgave it. So that, of course, can't happen indefinitely, but it was the kind of thing where a lot of things happened because of Occupy. And then, of course, mutual aid. Occupy, I would say one of its strongest aspects is the fact that they practice mutual aid in real time. And then in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy in New York City, actually the mutual aid groups from Occupy were the fastest, most effective responders, better than FEMA.
Wow, that's a fact I didn't know. I think the subtitle is an unfinished movement or something similar to that. So I know sometimes when we're coming up with these subtitles, it's informed by all the research and work that we did. Is that a case here where that was just a fitting subtitle for what you learned about the movement and like a lot of the things you just mentioned?
Right. So the subtitle is an unfinished uprising. And we think that this is basically not over, in a sense that, if anything, the system is even more rigged, right? The big, beautiful bill, the so-called big, beautiful bill, essentially funnels money upwards to people who already have a lot of money, and giving them tax cuts. So it's the kind of thing where I would say the precarity of work is also much worse today than it was in 2011. I think in 2011, we were really just starting to understand how even if you get a college degree, you often cannot have a career in the field that you studied, and you don't have work security in the way that you used to, or in the way people used to, especially if they had a college degree. And I think today that is much, much worse. I think the idea of going to college is being contested right now as being necessary for a lucrative, successful, in terms of money-making career in your lifetime.
Well, there's so much more I want to talk about sort of this idea as Occupy as sort of a blueprint. You mentioned the mutual aid, I think, is a huge one. Are there other things people can learn from how Occupy did what they did, that can apply to future movements?
Well, you mentioned mutual aid, and I think one of the big takeaways for me is the power of collective action. Like, they came together and they slept in the park together. And I think at some point there were 400 people sleeping in the park. And, 400 people is not a lot of people when you think about it. But look at the impact that they had. And the impact, of their idealism and their hopefulness and really their faith that if they band together and present an alternative, more just world, even this tiny park, even on a temporary basis, 59 days, I think it's really an inspiration for everybody that if we work together, we can accomplish things. We can have the kind of change that we desire.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the other side of that coin is if the media landscape back then in 2011, was able to get, amplify some of that hope. Like you say, 400 people is not a gigantic number, right? But its impact seemed to far outweigh that. What responsibility in terms of civic media for platforms like yours and mine? On the one side, I do a show where we talk a lot about our sort of toxic polarization environment, how we see what we want to see in things. We very quickly categorize it as, is this a good thing, a bad thing, a blue thing, a red thing? How does it fit in my ideological thinking mindset? But what responsibility do we have in covering, these anniversaries? How do we talk about these kind of movements without, feeding into a polarized narrative?
Right. Yeah. So Future Hindsight, like I said, is a mission-driven podcast. And what we try to do is inspire people to take civic action and be involved. And so at the end of each episode, we always, of the Future Hindsight show, as opposed to the Occupy narrative series, is we always ask our guest for tips on how to basically take the content of the conversation we've just had into civic action. Like, what can you do? One or two things they share. Most of the time, a lot of the times, people say you should vote. I think that's definitely the floor. At the very least, people should vote. This year is an election year, a midterm election year. People definitely need to go out and vote. And then we also ask what makes them hopeful. And so we hope that this inspires people to take civic action. And then in addition to that, of course, we have people on who are basically civic actors themselves. We call them citizen change makers. And so we hope to elevate their example to show everyday people that this is something that they can also do. And now, not everybody who is listening is going to be a scholar or an activist, but they can take the example of a variety of the topics that we cover and see where they can join up. That's one of the other big things that we've discovered is that joining an organization, joining a group of people who are already involved in an issue that you care about is really, really powerful and effective, because then you're not doing it by yourself. It's always better to do it in a group. But also, if you are really interested in the issue, then you're going to keep going, right? Like, if you're not really interested, you're going to say, oh, this is like, take my vitamins or something like this, and you stop. And so I think that's it it is my hope that this inspires people and gives them ideas about how to not be cynical, how to be hopeful, and how to take action.
Yeah, that's awesome. We do something similar on this show, so I'm going to turn that around on you, and then can you give us give the listeners a couple of practical tips for taking civic action?
So I think the most practical tip is to make sure you understand when there are elections in your district, because often there are off-cycle elections that people don't talk about. For example, in New York, of course, it's easier because that's a big media. It's a big media market, but they have mayoral elections in off-cycle years. They have special elections that are like in June, in July, in August, for a variety of reasons in a variety of races. That could be school board, and it could be your local assembly member, it could be for city council, whatever it is. Actually, if you can vote in state and local elections, that is the most powerful thing for you to do, because whatever happens in Washington normally doesn't affect you, immediately. But what happens at the state and local level definitely affects you.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Mila Atmos, thank you so much for making time for us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's really been a pleasure.
That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. Outrage Overload is a Connors Institute podcast. The Connors Institute for Nonpartisan Research and Civic Engagement at Shippensburg University works to disseminate high-quality, nonpartisan information to the American public around issues of societal well-being, democracy promotion, and news literacy. If you found this episode valuable, please share it or leave a review. It really helps. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,